RI Unit Podcast.
Episode 11. The Manufacturing Debate. Why Most Economists Get It Wrong. Presented by Professor Howard Nicholas. Bram Nicholas. With Roshan Madawala.
Welcome everyone to another RI Unit podcast. I have the honor of chairing the session. This is the July episode of the 2025 series. And our topic today is industrialization and its importance for developing countries in raising living standards, but also for advanced countries to revive their flagging economic fortunes. My name is Howard Nicholas. I'm Sri Lankan born, retired academic who spends his time writing and giving guest lectures, doing occasional podcasts like this one, and sometimes television interviews. I'm joined by Dr. Bram Nicholas, who recently got his PhD from the University of Colombo, and importantly, on the subject of industrialization. So we hope to hear a lot from Bram on this topic, given that he's fresh out of the blocks on this subject. Bram has written, co-authored and written many articles for international journals as well as newspapers, and on topics that extend beyond industrialization. I'm also joined by Roshan Madawala, CEO of RI Unit, a consulting research company that was set up in 2003 by Roshan, specialized in land economics. On that topic, Roshan is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Colombo on the subject of land economics. Welcome, both of you. I want to preface the discussion here with extending our thoughts and support to the Palestinian people, to those who are suffering in Gaza and the West Bank and elsewhere, that I think it's impossible nowadays to have a public event without extending your thoughts and support to the Palestinian people. We are living at a time of a massive Holocaust. I know that generally we don't digress like this, but I feel that this digression is extremely important. And I know that my two co-discussants also share that view. Okay, let me turn to Bram first and ask him to give us an indication about this apparent rise in interest in industrial policies. It appears to have come from nowhere, because for a long time this interest has been somewhat dormant. And to explain the reasons for this rise, especially and paradoxically in the advanced countries that are supposed to be industrialized themselves, most notably in the United States. Bram, can you share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, something really interesting has happened, right? I mean, it's taking it even broader. In economics, the West for the last 50 years has been such a champion of, let's say, neoliberal policies, free trade, free markets, really adamant on that. And generally the belief among economists and policymakers had been that the government should generally stay out of markets because they were seen as actually the enemy of economic growth. And I don't know whether you would say the same, Howard, but I think about the last 15, 20 years, suddenly this shift emerged where the government in the US, but also in Europe, started intervening more and more. Maybe at the beginning a bit by stealth, but now it's become very open about its interventionist policies. And so in a very basic way, we just see budget deficits are back, right? I mean, that used to be the number one thing where the government should not spend too much and generally balance its budget. But that has completely changed. Budget deficits are back at their levels we saw during the Second World War. But I think more specifically and more important even is something that people may have missed among all this government intervention is actually industrial policy has come back in such a big way. And I say come back because it used to be such a big thing in between the First and Second World War. It was such a big thing in the US and Europe, where they were industrializing at a rapid rate. And even after the Second World War, you got the whole rebuilding of Europe with the help of the US, and industrial policy was such a large part of that. And then for 70 years, that faded into the background. And it's now back in a big way. And actually, we have an interesting chart to show there, which I think will be surprising to a lot of people, is if we look here at the number of industrial policy interventions in the world, you can see that in 2010, it used to be extremely low and has catapulted up. And that in itself is interesting enough, the rise of industrial policy around the world. But then if we look at the right-hand side of this graphic, you can see that most of that is accounted for by Western Europe and other OECD countries. And so that tells you such a big story, that all this general belief that it was actually China and other developing countries that have mostly been implementing industrial policy, actually the West is fully on board now. And, you know, more than anywhere else, I think we've seen this shift in the US, right? Where basically Trump was elected for exactly this reason. And before I get into how they've sort of reintroduced industrial policy, let me preface it with this. Back when Trump was not yet elected for the first time in the run-up to that election, 2015-16, you get, you know, he's running for election, US president, and, you know, slowly is gathering support, and then suddenly very quickly. And I think still to this day, a lot of people in the US, but also outside, are wondering why. You know, why is this guy so popular? And aside from all the rhetoric that, you know, he says all these populist things and outrageous things, I think there's a fundamental truth underlying his popularity, and that is that there has been a growing weakness in the US economy. And that is actually what Trump used to talk about a lot. Now, from official statistics on the US economy, you wouldn't say that, right? I mean, GDP per capita has been growing at a very good rate, especially for an advanced economy, much higher than most European countries. So you wouldn't say that there's really a problem there. And, you know, if you look at things like the unemployment rate, in principle, that's been a pretty low rate. And nothing that any economist just looking at the surface would be too concerned about. But now here comes the interesting...
Before you go on, I wanted to just make this important point about this chart is, remember, we have lived for at least the last 30 years with this neoliberal thinking, which you still see in Sri Lanka, denying the importance of activist industrial policy interventions. And here you have something so stark that it makes me wonder what these people are now thinking. Because obviously there's a whole group of them that are simply ideologues. They say what their paymasters tell them to say. But there are others who genuinely believe it. And they are now in the quandary of having to say, no, our leaders have lost their minds. You know, this is absurd, this is nonsense, it's going to lead to the destruction of our economy, economic system, etc. But I don't hear these voices. I mean, they should be outraged at their own countries doing things that they have long criticized other countries for doing. And I find that this silence, I find telling and somewhat disturbing, because it suggests that a lot of them have been doing all of this because they see that's where the money is, you know, not because they genuinely believed it. There are a few that genuinely believed it, but, you know, the large majority seem to have been thinking, well, if I write something which plays to this sort of audience, then I'm likely to get them to pay me again and again, you know. And this is what I find particularly disturbing. It's like we've discussed this whole thing about printing money. You know, suddenly, after decades, actually, even hundreds of years of singing the same song, suddenly the establishment changes, and there's, on the part of those who have been talking about printing money causing inflation, there's either denial or ignoring this shift in thinking. You know, now we have industrial policy. It's the same thing.
In the West, right?
In the West. But later we'll come to it, also in Sri Lanka, you know. So supposing we have a discussion with some of our neoliberal friends in Sri Lanka, and we say, do you know that there's this massive rise of industrial policies all over the world? Look, here's a chart. And, you know, this chart is indicating that it's not just a marginal increase, but it's a massive rise. And now it is the centerpiece of the entire economic strategy in the United States, supposedly the dominant force in the
But
West.
the irony, Howard, is the concurrent decline in income equality in the West, right?
Yeah.
It's the Gini coefficient, I think, since the 80s, since the advent of Thatcherism and Reaganomics, the privatization. Now, I can speak for the UK, where the period that Bram was showing has led to a very difficult situation for the average working person. Even back in the 80s or 70s, having things like a telephone was considered a basic service where the citizens would not have to go through hell and having to battle a giant serpent to have a service provider, which now is so difficult. Just to give you an example of telecom. By the way, I successfully got rid of Netflix this weekend, and I've got rid of Barclays. So I feel my conscience is better, so I had to get that in. But yeah, my question to Bram and yourself is, the interventions are there. And in this time period, I haven't seen this chart before. It's actually quite a dramatic increase on the change, but it's also a time when obviously this intervention hasn't helped any of the people of the countries, not at least the majority, but obviously may have benefited the 1 or 2%.
Actually, Brahm, you were coming to that point, and Roshan added another aspect of that. I think you were coming to the unemployment, the apparent low level of unemployment, but Roshan added the income inequalities, which are also there, but no one talks about it very much. And we interrupted Brahm when he was about to get to that point. What has been pushing the advanced countries, particularly the US, down this road?
Yeah, I guess that's the question, right? Is why this sudden interest again in industrial policy? Like, what prompted these policymakers to go against the fundamentals of every economics textbook and introduce industrial policy? Are they just mad, or is there something going on? Generally, the answer has been Trump is nuts. So don't pay attention to anything he does. It's just insane, and leave it at that. But I think there we have to analyze, right, what is actually driving his popularity and what is driving him to say what he says and do what he does. And so that's where I go back to his run up to the first election and point to one critical thing that he said. He, at multiple speeches, said that he does not believe the official unemployment statistics. And he said it several times. He said they're absolute nonsense. The official one of 5%, so meaning 5% of the labor force in the US is unemployed. He said, I don't believe it. And I don't think you guys, my supporters, believe it, because you're constantly telling me that you can't get a job, your wages are too low, and you want a fundamental change. Now, the saddest thing is, as soon as he came into power, he completely flipped. So he starts talking about how great he is doing as US president. And one of the key statistics he uses to make his point is, he says, look at how low the official unemployment statistic is, citing that exact same figure that he was criticizing a few months before that. And again, he did the same with this election. So in 2023, he goes back to his original thing and says, look, Biden is doing a terrible job managing the economy. Don't believe the official unemployment statistics. They're much higher than they say they are. And now that he's back into power, again, the flip comes. It's, I'm doing a great job because unemployment statistics are, the official ones are very low. And I think here we just have to spend a bit of time analyzing that, because, again, like I said, on the surface, it seems everything is okay if you were to believe the official statistics. But if we examine what Trump was talking about, because he had a valid point, is actually the way that unemployment is calculated in the US. Because the way that it's done, and this is statistical manipulation at its best, is, of course, if you want to raise the employment statistics, so the ratio of employed people to the labor force, you can either increase the numerator or decrease the denominator. They do both. Okay, they do both by massaging the statistics. So the first thing they do is they say, our favorite indicator is what is called U3. Okay, U3, and we lump together part-time and full-time employment. So no distinction is made between part-time and full-time employment. and we just lump it all together and say those people are employed. And note that this can even be if you babysitted once in the past 4 weeks, you are technically part-time employed. So that is lumped in there and shown as an employed person. Okay, so that's the first thing. And they have a different indicator called U6, which does exclude those part-time positions. And you can see currently the difference between U3 and U6 unemployment is 4% and 8%. Okay, so there's a difference there. But now comes the bigger one, is the manipulation of the denominator. Okay, and this one is pretty horrendous. What they do, no matter if you look at U3 or U6 or whatever measure they have of unemployment, they artificially shrink the denominator by saying if you haven't found a job in the last year, so you continue to be unemployed, clearly you don't want a job. So we're going to exclude you from the labor force. And this is absolutely brilliant, because by putting it that way, you can inflate the employment statistic massively. And so there's what Trump was referring to is actually something Howard and I had been looking at for quite some time, is this guy who runs a website called Shadow Statistics, who actually calculate the unemployment rate based on how they used to calculate it. Okay, so before they did this massaging of the statistics, this is the way they calculated it. And the last reading was that 1/4 of the US labor force was actually unemployed, as opposed to the official rate that everyone uses, which stands at about 4%. Okay, so that is a massive difference. Absolutely massive. And for me, this explains so much as to why Trump is so popular and has been so popular. And another one, I think this one is more widely known, is the fact that even though incomes have risen since the 1970s, a major problem is that Americans have actually lost purchasing power. So once we start accounting for the increase in prices across the board, American wages have actually stagnated. Okay, they have not gone anywhere since the 70s. And this is also upsetting to a lot of Americans who are looking to the rest of the world, China, Japan, Korea, a lot of places where wages and living standards have actually risen, but theirs haven't, you know? So if they do have a job, generally we see that American wages have actually stagnated. Now, I should say that after 2018, that real wage has actually risen. But again, I would ask questions of the official statistics, because this is, for me, what got Trump reelected is the whole issue of inflation. And actually, the official inflation statistics, again, not reflecting the real situation. Because
and one should add in there Roshan's point about income distribution.
Also, absolutely.
Because that has deteriorated quite considerably, especially in the United States and Britain, especially in these two countries. And actually what Trump is about to do is going to make it significantly worse with his tax breaks for the rich, effectively.
Yeah, and if you look at, let's say, GDP per capita, per person in the US, that has continuously risen, even when you account for inflation. And so the question is, so normally that would be a good indication, right? Incomes are generally rising for everyone, even if you account for their purchasing power. But then why are wages stagnating? It's exactly what you and Roshan say. It's because what that GDP per capita is reflecting is actually the top 1% massively gaining in their income and in their wealth, but the bottom 50% either not going anywhere or it's been deteriorating.
Actually, Bram, your data, if it went beyond COVID, I'm sure the purchasing power has further deteriorated since then. As we all know, COVID had, particularly the supply side shock of COVID, led to inflation all over the world, supply side inflation. So I'm quite sure if we looked at it in the last 5 years, it's probably got a lot worse in terms of the purchasing power of US citizens, but obviously the globe as well, right? Where the average person's concerned. And things never really reversed back into their normal levels. They've maintained those, say, emergency level prices in most parts of the world. They may have stabilized, but I don't think anyone has really seen a reduction in the cost of essential goods and services for people.
Yeah. Yeah. And whether that's shown in the official statistics or not, I think here the American people should be taken seriously in the extent to which they're upset. And again, re-elected a man who I would say broke almost all of his promises the last time around. So you're asking yourself, why re-elect him? Well, I think they were upset again, but to get back to why I was making this point is Trump, but also Biden. And that's, I think, what people tend to forget, is that it's not just Trump that has been introducing industrial policy. And here, I mean, most recently, it's been the tariffs that I would count as industrial policy, and everyone has pointed to and discussed. Because remember, this is what he started with. He said, we have to solve this weakness in the US economy, we have to bring manufacturing back. And to do that, he saw as the solution this tariff policy. Now, I don't think it's going to achieve what he wants to achieve, but the point remains that from somewhere in his administration, and there are quite a few around him who are saying, actually, you need to revive manufacturing if you want to heal the US economy. And we have to look at Biden as well and acknowledge that, in effect, he said the same thing. It's not tariffs that he used to enact his industrial strategy, but he used subsidies. But both are industrial policies. It may not look like it because very cleverly they called it, they had the CHIPS Act, which was, I guess, quite explicitly to promote manufacturing of semiconductors. I remember that was $50 billion that was put aside for that alone. But then you had the Inflation Reduction Act, which was even bigger, and sold, at least in part, as a strategy basically to combat climate change. But note that almost everything in there was about manufacturing anything related to green energy. So electronic vehicles, batteries, but also semiconductors lumped in there, and the manufacture of solar panels and windmills. So a couple of economists were rightly saying, this looks an awful lot like industrial policy. No matter what you call it, we know that this is industrial policy. And so we can now recognize that there is actually bipartisan support in the US for reviving US manufacturing. And that has everything to do with the fact that there is this growing weakness in the US economy. And it's actually explained the best by J.D. Vance, who we showed last time around in the last episode we did, saying that what is not understood is when we shifted all of our production to the East, we actually lost more than just the US, than the manufacturing jobs. We lost more than that. We lost our ability to develop technology. Because this is what is missed in a lot of the discussions and also criticisms of industrial policy is critics say, well, you know, if it's not a manufacturing job, don't worry, you can get a job in services. But this is not the point. It's not just what directly is given by bringing manufacturing back. It's the technology development that comes with it. Because disproportionately, manufacturing accounts for a huge part of technology development in the economy. Okay, much more than its share of, let's say, GDP would suggest it does. So to give you an example, in the US, manufacturing as percentage of GDP accounts for about 11-12%. And so critics say, well, if it's that small, who really cares? You know, get rid of the whole thing, whatever. But it still, in the US, manufacturing accounts for 2/3 of all R&D done in the US. So if you go just by that GDP statistic, you're thinking, well, who cares? But J.D. Vance knows it's about more than that. It's about innovation in their country being lost to China, because with production, innovation also moved to China and other East Asian countries. Not only that, there's another aspect to it as well, which is the fact that manufacturing actually creates jobs in other sectors. So Biden's admin did a fantastic report on this and actually showed that for every manufacturing job created, there were 3.4 jobs created economy-wide, you know, because you need your administrators, you need lawyers, you need transport, you need retail for all of this manufacturing going on, warehousing. The list goes on. And this is why you can't just look at the surface of these statistics and say, you know, manufacturing is not that important, it's tiny. You have to actually understand that there's something special about manufacturing. And this is what is now being recognized by the US and European countries, because as soon as the US introduced its CHIPS Act, the Europeans were very quick to introduce their own, because they said, wait a minute, we should also hop aboard this train. And so they came with a 43 billion euro package, almost equaling that of the US, to promote their own semiconductor industry.
Bram, is this money going to SMEs, and is it geared towards fostering competition, or is it being absorbed primarily by your big corporations like the Teslas and your Microsoft, etc. in that?
You would think we had rehearsed this question, because it's the critical one, because this is the whole point, right? I think there are several problems with the way that the Europeans and Americans are introducing industrial policy. And perhaps one of the biggest is what you've indicated now, is the fact that they don't understand what China has done. It's not just supporting your companies, it's making sure that there's also a competitive environment. So I think we've said it many times on this podcast, the EV industry is the best to show that, is how many EV companies do you have in the US? Okay, there's only one serious one and maybe one or two others that are sort of there, but it's mainly Tesla. And Tesla received massive subsidies from the US government. But the problem with Tesla is that in the US, it has a monopoly. And so there's nothing really driving its innovation beyond a certain point. The only thing that is driving it is the fact that it's trying to compete in China. And so that's the secret to China's success. Is in China, it's a totally different story. You have more than 100 EV companies, electric vehicle companies, competing, fighting it out, trying to get their share of the market, and they have to innovate. They're forced to innovate. And some or all of them are being supported in some way or another. They're getting preferential treatment compared to companies in sectors that the Chinese government has not identified as being strategic. But they make sure, the Chinese government makes sure that even though they give support, they maintain a competitive environment. There has to be competition because they understand that that is a critical part of driving innovation in a country. So absolutely right. I think that's the other aspect of this, is it's not just about throwing money at the problem or putting up tariffs. It's a whole set of other things, that Trump and Biden don't seem to get, is you have to do much more than subsidies and tariffs. You have to set up a whole structure that starts creating this competitive environment and at the same time supports your manufacturers versus foreign manufacturers. And I think they haven't got
one of the things that we've been talking about, which is actually very relevant for countries like Sri Lanka, is the whole infrastructure that has been created. Basically energy, transport, communications. These are so vital for successful industrialization. Countries like Vietnam, incidentally, are finding roadblocks precisely because they haven't paid attention to some of the important infrastructure. This is being remedied, but paradoxically, by China. China coming in and helping them to build transport systems and supply chain backups and so on and so forth. But the infrastructure is something that the US has continuously found difficult. I remember, like 25 years ago, Hillary Clinton saying that if they wanted to repair all the bridges that had gone into disrepair and some of the main waterways, they would have to spend $21 trillion. $21 trillion. This is going back 25 years ago. And, when she mooted this type of expenditure, it was knocked down immediately, because there are so many lobbies in the United States that want a piece of the apple pie, so to speak, that it's very difficult for them to do something like that. But now, if you look at one of the major obstacles for them with this whole industrialization strategy is precisely the old and decrepit infrastructure that we're left with. What you'll likely have is some parts of the United States will go it alone, independently of central government. But actually, if you want to make the whole system work and utilize all the resources spread across a country as large as the United States, you need a coherent and ambitious infrastructure policy. And just getting the rail network in the United States to even 1/4 of the capacity that China has developed, would already make some difference. But it's almost impossible to conceive of that. And that is what Brahm, I think, also means by, you can't just identify this one policy or that one policy and just throw money at it, because, it's not, in the greater scheme of things, going to make that much of a difference. Roshan, you also had something that you were coming in, or you said what you...
Just to add that, I think to go back to something you guys, we have discussed previously, the Chinese, ironically, the Communist Party is the one that has succeeded in fostering competition, whereas the US economies and that of the West have gone the other way, to the detriment of everyone except for the people involved in making those deals between government and the corporate world, in all aspects, probably led by the military establishment, where we've come to a very unfortunate stage in the evolution of capitalism in the West, perhaps, as compared to China.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up and maybe ask Brahm to come back on is reading Brahm's PhD. There was a section in it where he looked at the literature. And one of the conclusions you come to, standard literature, is it's impossible for them to support an active industrialization strategy. It's impossible. So anyone studying textbook economics would have to automatically say that this is an incorrect strategy and it's likely to lead to economic disaster, which is what the standard rhetoric has been for quite some time. And I come back to the point I made much earlier. So now you have active industrialization policies from both the Democrats and Republicans in the United States, and not a peep from the academic community saying, no, this is actually wrong and it's going to be a mess. Again, I come back to the printing of money. So remember, we have taught all our students, generations of students, printing money is the cause of inflation, and any government that does that is liable to create hyperinflation. We've had the greatest experiment of all time of printing money, no inflation, in fact the opposite. Inflation continued to fall. What I'm saying is, you have these textbooks obviously misleading us. Obviously, because when push comes to shove, the policy makers ignore what they have been taught. Their advisors are ignoring what they have been taught at university on all the major policies. And I can also mention budget deficits there as well, which Brahm mentioned earlier. Now, this leads us to one important conclusion. What you are taught in economics courses is pure ideology. This is what you are taught is designed for policymakers and politicians to be able to use that as a weapon at certain junctures and in the context of certain countries. Because obviously they don't believe it. Look at the industrial policies. If they truly believe what they were taught, this is the last thing they would ever do. But all of them are rushing blindly. Where's the IMF and the World Bank, who have told developing countries, do not pursue activist industrialization policies? What are they saying about all of this? We sit opposite IMF and World Bank people in negotiations and discussions. Surely the first thing we should tell them is, look, stop telling us anything from the textbooks because you are ignoring it yourselves. And this is what I'm coming to now. This is so transparently obvious. Anybody that keeps repeating this nonsense in the context of what we are now living through, the most aggressive activist industrialization policies from whether it's Democrats or Republicans, they're all going to do the same thing. And here we have in Sri Lanka a lot of people saying, no, you have to do what the West has been doing, is having no activist industrial policies. And yet staring us in the face is the West actually turning around and saying, look, suckers, this was never meant to be serious. We don't take it seriously. This is just for you because we want to keep you down. You understand? You cannot help but have this message. Now, the intriguing...
It's great to mobilize an entire cohort of people who'll jump up and repeat these things at the right time.
Well, the intriguing thing is the Chinese have also been taught this. The Vietnamese have also been taught this, but they never took it seriously. Okay? From the word go, as soon as they were able to, they went for industrialization with activist policies. Unlike the West now, because they're starting from a low base, they've had to, let's say, build the whole infrastructure of the society. And that means it's a much more holistic set of policies. But nevertheless, while they nodded, and I've been teaching in China for 25 years, and I've been teaching alongside Western academics and economists who have been teaching the same nonsense textbooks that they've used in Western countries. But the Chinese, while nodding politely, have obviously ignored this from word go, at least the policymakers. And I find this dichotomy quite interesting, that when the time is right, the Western policymakers also ignore everything in the textbooks. And I mean everything.
And the hilarity, the hilarity there, I guess, is that actually when they try to explain the rise of China from their perspective or from their beliefs in it, so this still happens. I mean, the academics in the West might be silent on the policy that's being adopted in their own countries, but they continue to distort history when it comes to China and developing countries in general. Because, like you said, they can never say that it was the government's promotion of manufacturing in China that really was the key to its success, because that would completely destroy their textbook foundations. So they've been trying to find a way, since China started rapidly growing, they've been trying to find a way to say, actually, this is because of them following the textbooks. So the typical two pillars of that have been, they've liberalized trade, China, and China has liberalized its financial markets, because now if we get to the theoretical foundations of this neoclassical framework and neoliberal policies, that's always been it, right? Countries can only develop when they adopt free trade policies and liberalize their financial markets, because remember, for them, the key to success is making sure that companies can borrow freely from a private and developed financial sector. That is the key for them. So one crazy statistic that they have had to ignore at every single point is the fact that China actually never privatized its financial sector. So still to this day, over 85% of China's banking system is in the hands of the state, run by these 4 or 5, I think, big state banks. Oh. And they control most of the capital that flows through the financial system. So where they get the idea that this somehow was one of the pillars for China's success, the privatization of the financial sector, is beyond me. Okay, and then the other one is perhaps equally ridiculous, is the one that China actually liberalized its trade. And that was the other supposed pillar to their success. Because if you look at it, yeah, since the 1990s, they have actually reduced tariffs across the board. Never mind that they kept in place strategically aligned tariffs. So while they removed them for industries that they cared very little about, they kept them in place for things like cars, electric vehicles in particularly, and other high-end manufacturers that they wanted to develop and promote in China. But forget that. Let's just look at the evidence that these economists provide. They say the average tariff rate went down, and as it went down, China grew rapidly. Okay, but did anyone look at the other developing countries and what they did over that same time? They did exactly the same. It was a period when all developing countries were lowering tariffs. And so in the 1990s, that started, and by 2010, India had actually lowered its tariff rate more than China had, its average tariff rate. So if we follow the logic of the neoclassical economists, this should mean that India and not China should be the successful one. And I'll point out that India's financial markets are far more privatized than those of China. So in India, actually less than 50% is in the hands of the state when we look at the banking sector. Okay. And for China, as I said, that's much higher. It's 85%. So the statistics make absolutely no sense for their argument. But we know that there are theoretical problems there as well. But I don't know if we want to get into that now.
Well, I just wanted to ask you to comment on something that I read in your PhD, which I found interesting, because again, it was kept under wraps, and that is that the Korean financial system was state-dominated, during all their most important industrialization, the formative industrialization period. And they were only forced to start privatizing their financial system during the financial crisis, but and you had some data and statistics on it, which I found was totally incredible, because they were using virtually all the commercial banks, which were state commercial banks, as development banks, which, and, linking companies like Hyundai and various other companies with these state banks, which I found was quite insightful thing. Did Taiwan have the same? I can't remember.
They had the same, absolutely. And this is the thing, right? So economists have had to, first of all, ignore statistics, and second of all, treat every economist economy in isolation. So never compare, because then we get into trouble, because then we start seeing patterns that disagree completely with the neoclassical ideology. And so what you are highlighting now is the fact that China, but before China, there was Korea, there was Taiwan, there was Singapore, there was Hong Kong, there was Japan. And all of them did this exact same thing. It was manufacturing that was the core of their rapid growth, and all of their governments adopted aggressive industrial policy. And so it was the promotion of their domestic manufacturers that in the end made the difference. And we see that all the other countries, all the other developing countries in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and present, when their governments aren't adopting aggressive industrial policy, they actually don't grow rapidly. They actually get into trouble. And so that has been the main difference if we look at successful developing countries that have now become rich countries like Korea and Japan and Taiwan, and developing countries that basically they may have marginally improved or improved quite a bit, but they're still nowhere near rich country status and have not been able to attain that since gaining independence in the post-war period. And so we're talking of 80 years. And the question is why? You know, what's going on there? What could it possibly be that they keep on failing to do the right thing? And the evidence is very clear. It's the difference between manufacturing development and the extent of industrial policy being implemented. And
Now, that's an important point, and it leads us to the discussion of Sri Lanka and other developing countries, Brown, because you, in the PhD that you did, and which I should give a plug for, it is going to come out in a book in the not too distant future, but in that there were a number of criteria that you applied to actually help us understand which countries are successfully industrializing and which aren't. Because, you know, if one looks at Sri Lanka, even the concept of industrialization is completely misunderstood and quite distorted in most of the discussions. So it would be good for us to get an idea before we get into Sri Lanka and also countries like Bangladesh and India, what you found as the most important characteristics of a successful industrializing country.
Well, one of the first things I would say is that it's always directly related to exports. Because in the final instance, that's how we saw in the statistics that manufacturing had truly developed in a country if they had become internationally competitive. And so they would invariably gain in, let's say, the global, in terms of their share of global exports, they would gain massively. And that was driven fundamentally by manufacturers. The way that they did it, and this is the crucial element in it, is by moving up the value chain. And so what we mean with that is, I think to date, almost every country that I studied that industrialized started with producing garments. And I mean from the very beginning, because everyone knows this about Britain when they started, that they were the dominant power when it came to manufacturing garments. But right up to present, we see that the latest case of industrialization, that being Vietnam, started by becoming a major garments manufacturing hub. And it still is, you know, it's still very important in their manufacturing sector. But all of them started the same way, whether we're talking about Taiwan, Korea, Germany at one point, you know, all of them started with manufacturing garments and then slowly started shifting into higher value added manufacturing production. And that as the global economy modernized, that of course became more and more about machinery, but also electronics, electrical products, transport goods, cars, planes, that sort of thing, and all their components. And it's that movement up the value chain that we really saw was critical. Because if we look at Sri Lanka, it could actually be argued that they never went beyond that point. in the 1990s, garments manufacturing was such a big thing in Sri Lanka, and there were many companies that had become successful by that point, internationally as well. And Sri Lanka had gained in its share of global garments exports to a very great extent. And actually, the economy was growing very rapidly. It's one of the highest growth rate periods in Sri Lanka's history. But then it failed to continue the industrialization on the industrialization path and never moved up that value chain. So to this day, electronics manufacturing is almost completely absent in Sri Lanka. Car manufacturing, almost completely absent in Sri Lanka. No real machinery production to speak of. And that has been the main problem and was, like you said, one of the conclusions we arrived at is it's so important to start with a proper definition of what you mean by industrialization. Because we noticed it in Sri Lanka, right? We were talking to policymakers and journalists who were, we thought were, let's say, had a different economic framework to us, but then they suddenly said, no, we're with you. We also believe in industrialization. We're thinking, what? Wait a minute, what do you mean by that? And they're saying, like agro-industrialization. That does not sound familiar. That does not sound like something we're talking about. So somehow agriculture had entered the definition of industrialization for them, as long as you modernized it in some way. And then, other strange things like you could just produce low value added manufacturers and stay in that range. You're muted up.
Presentation I gave recently, somebody came and said, that's why we have to support tourism, because that's part of industrialization. I politely had to ignore the comment.
Well, and the statistics, again, are so clear on this, right? We've seen it in the past where we see all the East Asian countries that have been successful in the 20th century. They clearly had one very common path, and that was manufacturing more and more high technology. Okay, so it was very clear what that was about. It wasn't tourism that they focused on. It's not that there was no tourism in those countries, but it was definitely not supported by government, and it's not where we saw the rapid growth. And
actually, if I can share some details of what happened in Sri Lanka in the 90s, bro, and maybe how this could maybe inspire a future industrialization policy. So if you take the number of enterprises that were operating export processing zones in 1994, it was just 957, but by 2002, that had gone up to 2,295. That didn't happen automatically. So if you go back to 92, back in the day, it was called the GCEC, before the BOI. And they went to India, to Netherlands, to South Korea, to Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, and countless other places, campaigning and promoting Sri Lanka as a destination for manufacturing investment in the free trade zones. 93, similarly, Malaysia, Germany, UK, France, the Netherlands, the Middle East. 94, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan. And this goes on, 95, 98. It's documented pretty well. So there's a lot of hard work that went into getting these numbers to reflect in terms of export value, but in terms of employment. And if you look at the free trade zones, Niflam, can we look at Exhibit A, if you don't mind, just to show you what this did look like? Maybe it can inspire a future policy for Sri Lanka. So if you take employment, for example, it went from just over 40,000 workers. You might want to zoom in on the map, if you don't mind. 45,000 workers to almost 200,000 people working in the free trade zones. And this was also planned in a way that generated employment. So you could see in terms of the logistical arrangements, the free trade zones were built and promoted in somewhat close proximity to the port. But I think they also considered things like the impact on employment opportunities. Aside from that, we went into some detail on the impact. If you take a place like Sitawaka, where the free trade zone, or Avisawela, the impact it had on the whole town, as you said, manufacturing and industry cannot just simply be looked at as a number, but in terms of the entire range of benefits that it has. So the population in this area increased on the back of a huge influx of mainly rural workers coming in. And this led to a trigger effect on transport services, on the retail sector, real estate, housing, roads were introduced. So today, if you go to Avisawela, what you see is a bit of a bustling town, which is entirely due to the impact of the local free trade zones that were initiated in the 90s. So that may not be reflected in numbers, but it's the impact it has. And similarly, in Kandy, Pallekala, Katunaika was one of the largest ones, where we saw, I think, something like 40,000 workers over the years from 1990 to 99. As you said, the mainstay of the early years was garments, but they never really moved forward. I mean, food and beverages was a small percentage, paper products, chemicals, petroleum, a few metal products, but I would say 90% of the activities that took place in the free trade zones were, in fact, led by garment exports. But the net effect, of course, there were concerns. The predominant composition of the workforce was female, and this at the time led to various social issues which had to be addressed, but they were, I think, for the most part. So if you look at the composition, typically a free trade zone worker profile would be a semi-educated, semi-skilled female machine operator. But many of these people also moved up the ladder and became supervisors, managers, etc. So you only need to look at the numbers. As I said, more than 40,000 people employed at Katunaika, for example, and the impact on the local economy was huge, which may not be reflected in the GDP statistics. And just to get back to something Howard said about energy, communication, and transport, I always like to come back to Maldives, which I feel is a country which is always boxing above its weight. And recently, when I met a government official regarding a very bold move to ban Israeli tourists from going to Maldives, something that unfortunately Sri Lanka hasn't managed to do yet. They said that their sense of let me put it another way. They don't have a situation where they feel that their thinking is colonized. They have not had to deal with shaking off the yoke of colonialism. So they were able to take I wouldn't even call it a bold step, I would call it a human step to ban tourists from a country that's found guilty of committing genocide. But then, back to economics, Howard. In terms of energy, the Maldives has a huge initiative to become energy independent, to become sustainable. Something like 14% of their GDP goes into energy. Similarly, transport is huge. They have the world's largest seaplane fleet in the world, which used to be government owned, but I think they recently sold it off. I think Blackstone or someone may have bought it up. So that's something which I know is a concern for many people. And similarly, communication, that's an industry that's run by primarily a government-owned institution, which accounts for like 9% of GDP. So yes, it may not fit perfectly into Brown's model of industrialization, but they too have obviously taken the aspect seriously, whilst being very dependent on tourism because of its naturally being blessed with that capacity. It is still taking steps to maybe learn from the lessons of COVID, etc., and continue to boost these things. I digress to Maldives, but in Sri Lanka, it's not a happy story if you look at the stats. Whilst Bangladesh went from 15.8 billion exports in 2010 to 40.8 billion, 157% increase. Sri Lanka went from 16 billion to 17 billion over the same period, with a 7% increase in that. If we look at Exhibit B, was number 2, Niflan, just to give you an overview of the comparison between Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Whilst, as Brahm said, Sri Lanka did take the bold step to initiate its industrialization policy through the 90s, it failed to move up. I don't know, perhaps Howard can explain what happened. Bangladesh, on the other hand, continued to invest in their industrial sector, which went from 29% in 2010 to 37% of GDP by last year, whilst they maintain agriculture and services as well. Sri Lanka, by contrast, went from 28% to 25% where manufacturing was concerned over the period to 2010 to 2024. I think there's a lot of background to these stats, as I explained with the free trade zone. But as an overview, I think as economists that try to be progressive and useful in our thinking, perhaps we have to revisit what was done earlier, revitalize it. Maybe in Sri Lanka's case, now we have the port city, where maybe you could leverage that and the benefits that foreign companies would get by positioning themselves or locating themselves there. And if you allow them to also engage in manufacturing, perhaps that could be one of the policies where industrialization could be re-triggered. Because I know at the moment, things like EV manufacturing, when you speak to the people in the industry, they will say, yes, we should be doing more. We need to plug into the supply chain. We can do these things in Sri Lanka, but there's only like a handful of people making small components in the automobile industry. It's minute. Whereas the potential is huge, and people in this industry feel that a chance has been missed. I don't know if it's too late, but for example, India is very well connected in the EV supply chain. Sri Lanka has ample opportunity, if they were supported with government policy, to enter this supply chain, play a role, and develop the industrial sector in this way. Comes back to something that a professor from the Columbia University said recently, that every time we get the IMF and the likes of the IMF come in, say, basically say, hit the ball, and then say, go fetch it. By contrast, Sri Lanka needs to set its field and tell the bowler where to pitch the ball, and then you will have a much better chance of success. So if the whole, all the facets of our policy on industrialization with the macroeconomic strategy was in sync, we would surely be able to move up the chain, as you have said, Vietnam, Thailand, and the other tigers and emerging Southeast Asian economies have. Where do you think we should go with this? I mean, what can the government do, Howard?
I just wanted to come up with a couple of comments directly in response to that. One, so there's now a discussion, let's grant that people are talking about what we're talking about, that's manufacturing as the base for industrialization. But the history of the policy recommendations is not good. One of the things that is being missed is what Bram was referring to, is technology upgrading, especially for export-oriented industries. And that requires government support, and massive government support, which is not forthcoming because we have a lot of people who have been trained using the traditional textbooks and they don't realize those were there for ideological purposes. I mentioned this because during this experimental period of aggressive promotion of industry, one company emerged which should be the standard bearer for what we do in the future, and that is a company called Lodestar. So this produced solid rubber tires, the tires that are used for aircrafts and heavy industrial machines, tractors and the like. Now, Lodestar was set up as a joint venture between a local engineering company and a foreign person who had left Michelin, but had the world lead in the production of these solid rubber tires. And within a period of 10 years, with government support, they went from a non-existent entity to dominating the whole industry worldwide. In other words, surpassing the US, surpassing France, surpassing Germany. Korea was also a producer. This was the number one. And one of the things that accounted for their success was that the engineering company developed industrial robots that was able to lift these heavy tires and move them around and so on and so forth. In other words, the innovation took place on the factory floor because it was an engineering company that was in a joint venture. Now, you fast forward, you see, under the Rajapaksas, when Mahinda was prime minister, he initiated or he supported the establishment of the Nano Institute. And that institute, its job was to develop technology. But here's the problem. You're developing technology without reference to manufacturing. And so, as a good friend of ours who was involved in setting the whole place up and developing a lot of the technologies which were patented, said that actually these technologies were not used by any Sri Lankan company. In fact, what happened is the institute was closed down. The patents were sold off to a number of companies who then sold it on to foreign companies. So the whole experiment was worthless. Moral of the story is you've got to get manufacturing going, and you have to support the technology developments in manufacturing. Returning to garments is a pointless exercise for us. We have to go upstream. And that requires a serious commitment to supporting the export-oriented manufacturers. Of course, there's some rationale for supporting domestically oriented manufacturers, but the majority of support should be given to these export-oriented manufacturers. Now, here is an irony that we look at people like Joseph Stiglitz in the United States and a lot of economists linked to the Democratic Party. And one of their gripes with Trump is that he is shutting down a lot of the innovative research centers that the US has been busy cultivating. But actually, he may not be that stupid, because he has understood, and as J.D. Vance actually said in that short clip we had, is that innovation must come in manufacturing. What we have done is, he said, what the US has done is basically transferred all of that to the developing world, especially Southeast Asian. And bringing manufacturing is not about jobs. It's actually bringing back the process that develops this advanced technology and integrates it in the everyday lives and work habits of ordinary people, and now we think of them as stupid, and J.D. Vance as some country hick, etc. But actually, they sound far more intelligent to me than Nobel Prize winners like Stiglitz, who is lamenting the fact that Trump is cutting funding to a lot of these research units that actually are not having this integrated approach. I mean, they don't work with industry directly. And that is also the big difference with China.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you've heard the story of AI in China. See, the Chinese don't develop AI for the sake of developing AI. They're not interested. But look at their EVs now with AI built in to the EVs, these independent suspension vehicles where each wheel is controlled separately. So this is why they can go over this very rugged terrain.
My gosh.
I
rented in
champagne.
England.
Sorry?
Yeah, I rented one of these monsters for 2 weeks when I was in England this summer, and it's like having your own robot. You could speak to it.
And that's with nearly all, like now their drones are all AI enhanced, because for them, AI is not a thing that you just develop, but rather it has to be integrated into the various products that they're making. And that AI then does certain specialized things, which is mostly useful for the development of that product. You see that? This difference in approach. I mean, we wasted, I don't want to say wasted money on the Nano Institute, but basically it didn't get us far.
There was also an initiative during the previous regime with Sri Lanka to launch a satellite, which didn't really take much. And the purpose, who knows, right? Because as you said, it wasn't linked to a specific goal. It was just
I think this is one of the important things that came out of Brahm's study. And one of the things that he used it, maybe he can say more on that, is what is an industrializing country? What is a deindustrializing country? And how do we understand that? Because that debate, it's an academic debate, but it helps us again get to grips with what do we mean by the process of industrialization. Brahm?
Yeah, I mean, there we kind of identified two things, right? So the first was really looking at, let's say, the methods of production. And what I mean there is, again, the misconception about China is that production takes place there mostly because they have cheap labor costs. It may have started out like that, but believe me, now that is definitely no longer the attraction, because if you compare it to other countries like Thailand and Vietnam, labor costs in China are at least three times as high. And so why continue to produce there? Well, because actually they are far more productive in China than they are in other countries, because their methods of production have advanced far beyond most other developing countries. So one of the things that we can see there is, for instance, the density of robots, industrial robots in Chinese factories. And that, if you look at how many industrial robots per worker are in an average factory in China, is much and much higher than other developing countries. But forget about that, it's now higher than it is in the United States. And actually, China has one of the highest ratios. So it means that their methods of production are now very advanced. Workers are highly productive. And then the other thing we looked at is we say, okay, that's one aspect, but the other is really the development of the products itself. And so there we can see that China's success is really reflected in another way by how it has started to dominate all the high-tech product industries. So indeed, looking at drones, looking at EVs, and now it's starting with semiconductors as well. You know, it's becoming a massive player in that, and it's advancing. And so it's those two metrics that we generally looked at. And I think an important point there to make is, which also brings me back to why it's so important to incorporate technology into the understanding of industrialization, is I wanted something that could show a common factor throughout the ages, right? So looking at the very first case of industrialization, that being Britain in the 19th century, going all the way forward to Vietnam now as the most recent one in the last 20 years, to show a common factor. And what we basically then, what I needed to do is to have a concept that allowed for that. So it's very simple, right? The world has changed since then. There were no semiconductors in 1850. There were no cars. There, was no real machinery to speak of. So the most advanced thing then was the production of garments and textiles. But can you still do that in this day and age? No, because the world has moved far beyond that. So what was technologically advanced then is no longer technologically advanced now. And so, although the way that it looks on the surface in terms of what's been produced and the way it's been produced has changed, the concept is the same. What every country has to do when it's in that process of industrialization is shift to the most advanced forms of manufacturing. It's not just anything or, what was good enough 100 years ago. It's moving beyond that and looking, okay, what are the most advanced sectors now? And there it is understood that Sri Lanka can't do the same as China has done, because it simply, doesn't have the capacity to set up, multiple EV companies that start producing all over the place. Sure. But then we have examples like Singapore, which have cornered specific parts of high-tech supply chains and said, right, this is where our companies now dominate. So they have a massive chunk of the semiconductor supply chain, very high end in terms of the design and final stages of production, that a lot of Singaporean semiconductor manufacturers specialize in. And so this is part of busting another myth that Singapore owes its success to services. Absolutely not true. It moved up the manufacturing value chain, started with low-end manufacturers, and then gradually moved up, and its manufacturers are now some of the most sophisticated in the world when we look at the semiconductor industry, but also things like pharmaceutical.
I have been notified that we have about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to... Sorry, Roshan, what were you saying?
Sorry, just wondering where the notification came from, but anyway.
From one of your colleagues. But I just wanted to make one point again on Sri Lanka, and it now comes back to things that both of you said. I'm now coming increasingly to the conclusion that one of the most important reasons for ensnaring developing countries in this horrendous debt trap that many of them find themselves in is to give the government no space to support manufacturing. I mean, if you just look at Sri Lanka and how much of the budget goes to servicing our debt, it's impossible for them to devote the sort of resources they actually should devote to manufacturing. And Sri Lanka is not alone. I would bet that 80 to 90% of sub-Saharan African countries are in the same boat. I would bet that about 60 to 70% of Latin American countries are also in the same boat. And I don't think this rise of this egregious debt problem in the developing countries is an accident. I think rather than relying on developing countries sticking to what the advanced countries have told them to do, they rather entrap them in debt. And I think Sri Lanka is exactly there. They have absolutely zero room to maneuver, and it'll be the same for anyway the duration of this current government, because they have accepted all the debt obligations at whatever conditions, on whatever conditions the foreign creditors have asked for. And this gives them zero room to maneuver. So they end up relying on things like tourism and remittances and hoping for the best.
Howard, don't you think, or do you think there's any hope that this government will renegotiate the terms agreed with the IMF on the basis of so many things that have happened, not least the fact that the whole fundamental concept behind the WTO has been shaken up by the Trump tariffs? A country that's supposed to be given a soft ride to pay back its debt is instead being threatened by the very country where these IMF agreements are taken to the legal level where necessary. The US is threatening them. The whole legitimacy of the Western so-called rules-based order has crumbled in front of everyone's eyes in the face of an ongoing genocide. And the fact that so many other countries now have arrived at a similar situation as Sri Lanka, where the voice to say, that's not a good deal, IMF, relook at it. We can't be borrowing from you or going to sovereign debt to repay debt loans. We need different model. Do you think there's hope for at least a watershed moment?
I don't, actually, Roshan. I don't, because I actually believe a lot of this was set up and engineered with this result in mind. And look, the international community doesn't give a damn for the genocide being committed in Gaza. Do you think they'll worry about the economic damage being done to developing countries, which actually doesn't hurt them? In fact, it benefits them in lots of ways. I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I support debt justice. I support calls for cancellation. But I wouldn't hold my breath that the West is actually going to see any type of morality issue swaying them whatsoever. I mean, they have exposed the nature of their morality with Gaza. I'm sorry. I don't trust the West at all on any moral footing whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think there's a case to be made there that, of course, this is perhaps the most horrible materialization of that, but we've seen it before. We should not be surprised. It's not like the international bodies, IMF and World Bank, ever had a moral compass and that their allegiance was ever in doubt, because you remember we saw the example of Chile, where prior to Pinochet coming in, who was it, Salvador Allende? Who was there? His government was very nationalistic and not at all looked favorably upon by the Americans. So they did everything they could to get rid of him and install Pinochet. But together with that, for those that think that the IMF and World Bank somehow have the interests of the developing world and the global South at heart, they refused to give loans to the Allende government, but they did once Pinochet got in. So once Pinochet got in and he had already established that he was a murdering psychopath, the World Bank happily gave loans to the amounts of billions, while it refused to do that with the government that was previously there, the democratically elected government. So moral compass, they never had it. Their allegiance always clear with the North, the global North, and against the global South. And people, especially in Sri Lanka, should really read up on their history if they're in doubt about what the intentions are of these international bodies and whether they can ever act in Sri Lanka's interests. And I mean, beyond that, just have a critical examination of the policies that are now recommended, which we come full circle, look nothing like the policies that are currently being adopted by the advanced countries, i.e. industrial policies.
Thank you, Brahm. Thank you, Roshan. For the sake of the temperature of your support group behind you, Roshan, I will now end this podcast. I think it's been an interesting podcast, and we've managed to get quite a number of issues put on the table, not resolved, but definitely put on the table. Now, it's my understanding that we're trying to get another podcast where there's a debate with amongst a group. I don't know if we're included in this group, but basically to debate a potential industrialization strategy. And
it's no group without Howard and Brahm. I would personally say thank you for restoring my faith in economics by exposing it for what it is, and then maybe move on to what it can be.
Right.
Yes.
Thanks, Roshan. Much appreciated. We look forward to joining you again in the next podcast. And thanks, everyone, for listening
Thank you
to us.
Thank you. Thanks, Howard.
Bye-bye.